Before I begin, I just want to show you a study that HSBC has done in 2017, where they asked a whole bunch of recipients what they can do without if money is tight. And as you can see, I mean, Fibre is right at the bottom with people wanting to rather live without food or mobile data or various other things before they actually give up their broadband connection, which is very interesting. So we know there's huge demand, and none of us would be here if there wasn't actually any demand. So the next question really is just where we are today, where we are going in terms of our fiber deployments in South Africa, and whether we can actually sustain the growth that we have today. We know everybody wants it, but can we actually afford to take the fiber to where everyone wants it? So the interesting thing is that, I mean, we're growing currently at around 600,000 new homes that's passed every year, which is quite extraordinary. But if you extrapolate that and you get to 2023, you get to around 3.7 million homes. So the question is really, are those homes really there? So if we look at the demographics for South Africa, I mean, we have roughly 17 million households in South Africa, but of course we can't take fiber to every one of those households because not everybody can afford the fiber. Some of those homes are very far spaced apart, and we actually need some geographical density for it to actually make sense, and so forth and so forth. So if we actually build a little matrix here showing, you know, your top income groups, LSM 10, LSM 9, LSM 8, and LSM 7, and we actually start applying certain filters. So we can see there's 2.7 million homes in LSM 10, that's your top kind of income groups, and then we go, that gets more as we actually go lower down the income groups. So first of all, we need to filter into what's densely populated, because if the homes are too far apart, we can't actually deploy fiber there because it would be too costly. And then the second thing is that we actually need to have decent clusters of homes in close proximity, because you can't go and build a fiber network and there's 200 homes and then for hundreds of kilometers there's no other homes, because then you can't actually establish an office there, you can't have maintenance teams, you can't have salespeople and so forth. The whole economic model doesn't work. So that filters it down some more. And then where we've all been focusing our builds is really in the major metros. And then we get to the income groups of LSM 10, LSM 9, LSM 8, that's really where the primary focus have been today. So if we look there, that number is roughly 2.4 million homes. So clearly we can't build 3.7 million homes if there's only 2.4 million homes in the major metros. Something has to give. So that brings us to kind of like two categories. Either you can go down in the food chain and target lower income groups, or you can go into the more rural areas, but it presents various challenges. So let's look at the lower income groups first. First of all, we have to concern ourselves with affordability. Can those homes actually afford the broadband service at the current rates? So there's some concerns, and the lower you go down into the income groups, the more you actually have to drop the price, which puts some further strain on the business model. The second thing is really, if you actually go to the unbanked, then you can't actually transact with them the same way we've all been used to. They can't do a debit order, you have to do prepaid. If you have an open access ecosystem where you have multiple service providers, then are we going to insist on each service provider actually doing their own prepaid at every spaza shop and every retail shop? I mean, Frogfoot today has more than 70 service providers. It becomes somewhat impractical. So we have to come up with new ways to actually address these problems. Registration is also an issue. I mean, for instance, if you go to somebody in a low income group, they might not have ID readily available, so RICA becomes a problem. There's all these kind of sign-up issues that we take for granted in high-income households that suddenly apply if we actually go into townships and so forth. And then there's the really the ability of the consumer to consume the service. So if somebody doesn't have a TV and they don't have a laptop, how are they actually going to browse the internet? So you have to ensure that they actually have a TV. You have to ensure that they have tablets and phones and computers to actually consume the service. And then once they have those devices, you have to ensure that they actually have access to the right content. Do they have Netflix? Do they have Showmax? Do they have gaming services, audio streaming services, and so forth? These things do not necessarily exist in those income groups. So you have to embark on a whole series of transformations to actually bring those kind of services to those households. So those are some of the challenges that we all face in the lower income groups. So what about the rural areas? So in the rural areas, it's not a walk in the park either, because first of all, the homes are built on larger properties. I mean, the one thing that the rural, and I'm not talking deep rural, I'm talking, let's say we go to a Swellendam or we go to a Heidelberg, any of these rural towns, you have bigger earth sizes. That means it's more costly to deploy fiber. There's less multi-dwelling units. You don't see a lot of apartment blocks in small towns. So that all increases the cost of a fiber deployment. Backhaul is a major issue. I mean, we all have lots of fiber routes. All cable systems terminate in the major metros. There's various cable system, national long-distance routes that connect all the major metros. But there's surprisingly little actually connecting the smaller towns. And even where there's national fiber routes running past those towns, the networks have not been designed to drop off large amounts of capacity in those towns. So there's a huge cost discrepancy between bringing fiber from a metro into a very small town compared to the major metros. And that adds to the overall cost of the deployment. Market size is another problem. If you have a small town, you have 1,000 homes, you have to build an office there, you have to have a maintenance team in that small town, you have to have a sales force in that small town that look after that town. And those costs become a very big percentage of your overhead in maintaining and operating that network. So obviously there's a breakdown where if the town is simply too small, you have to either have other types of businesses. So some companies like the WISPs have been successful in doing that, where they might have a wireless network and they might have wireless links to farms and so forth to actually substitute or enhance the revenues that they actually get from those towns. But if you're a pure fiber operator going into the small towns, you have to make do with the revenues that you can get from a small number of customers. Local government is also sometimes a challenge. The local governments, some of the issues that we've experienced there is that they're just not as geared to a contractor suddenly rocking up there with hundreds of people and digging up every street. They want the deployments to go much more slowly. That imposes some challenges in terms of the economics of the deployment. Sometimes the local governments do not really know what the process is that they should follow, so the wayleave and build permitting process actually takes longer. And sometimes those local governments also have their own agendas where they might want to deploy fiber for themselves as an additional revenue stream. Another complication that we find with local government is all municipalities are not well run. So you go into a municipality like a Mafeking or a Mthatha, and you generally have infrastructure that is not well maintained and deteriorating, and that presents other challenges. The residents are leaving that demographic, and also you can't rely on all the services like you can in the more metropolitan areas. So these are just some of the local government issues that we have to face as well. And then the last but not least, I mean, every small town has some wireless ISP, 1, 2, sometimes even 3, that currently has a customer base in there. For them, it's their bread and butter. They have not made a major capital investment in there, but they maintain the relationships with all those customers. And you can't just simply go into those towns and not forge some form of relationship with the wireless ISP and ensure that their business can continue to operate in the manner it has been operating. So either they have to pivot from a wireless business into a fiber business or substitute the wireless business with fiber, but there has to be some interaction with the local operators to ensure that it's sustainable for both the fiber operator and the existing incumbents in those small towns. So then we can just look at, has anyone actually been doing it? Because there's all these issues that we actually have to deal with in rural areas and in the lower LSMs, and the answer is a resounding yes. Today, you would have, or over the past couple of months, you would have seen announcements in the media in the lower LSMs where Vuma has entered Mitchell's Plain and is deploying aggressively in the Cape Flats. Frogfoot has started our deployments in Soweto. And so there are certainly efforts being made to actually go down into these lower income groups because it's a large market and there's a potential huge upside to going into those. But the jury is still out whether all those challenges will be overcome. And it's certainly not a proven business model such as the LSM 8 to 10 metro fiber business. In the rural areas, again, there's various operators that has been deploying fiber under the radar, certain WISPs, and a lot of them have been acquired by Eurotel. Eurotel has quite a few towns that they have actually built, and a while ago I even saw an article of a minute town in the Free State with around 100 residents which had fiber to the home, which is amazing. And I suppose it makes a lot of sense for a wireless provider to pivot into fiber because they have the revenues to sustain their operations in those towns already. We have, of course, embarked on some deployment in smaller towns, and we are aggressively targeting what I call the tier 2 towns, so not too small, but not as big as the major metros, and there we have less of these challenges because you still have reasonably high kind of clusters of homes, so it makes sense to actually establish an office and maintenance teams and sales teams there, and also in the larger areas the population is still dense enough to justify the fiber investments. Lightstruck is a more recent kind of entry into the market and has gone after places like Hermanus and Paarl and so forth. And almost every month I see another WISP that want to enter into a smaller town. So absolutely there's a lot of activity there, but I think we definitely have to walk a long road to determine whether these efforts will be successful. And that's really just what I wanted to communicate with you. I won't hold you up longer because we started a little bit late. So just if anyone has any questions, please let me know. Cool. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I'm from the Coca municipality in Jeffreys Bay. Thank you. And we're probably one of those tier 2 towns that you were mentioning. Our concern is that we're getting a lot of people coming in, sort of digging up pavements, and often at a low quality of work that we don't really have control over. And sort of, Wayleave, we are reasonably well organized in terms of giving access to the companies that are coming in. Our concern is that municipalities need to generate additional revenue streams, and that's not necessarily going into fiber ourselves. But do you think there's a way forward that we could partner up, say Frogfoot came into a town like Jeffreys Bay, that there could be some kind of rental being paid for using our infrastructure? Because at the moment we've got about 4 or 5 different companies with fibre in the ground, but nobody's paying anything to the municipality for that. Is there a revenue model going forward that could work for everybody?
I think in the long run, it's absolutely imperative that we try and keep the value chain as short as possible when it comes to fibre, because the fibre is not the main revenue driver. It's the services that's layered on top of that and the economy that it actually stimulates. So we see fibre as really almost a commodity. It needs to be as cheap as possible and as widely accessible to everyone as possible, because once it's in there, it changes the behavior of the consumers. It changes the new business models that get enabled. Because, I mean, if you think about it, there can be an entrepreneur in Jeffreys that currently is not able to start a business there because they don't have readily available access to the internet that's fast, and they can't compete in the global marketplace. But you bring fibre to that person's home or that person's business, suddenly it enables him. Tomorrow he starts a new app, that becomes a big business, and suddenly Jeffreys have a new business that is bringing in taxable income to that local municipality. So that it's almost the derivative of fibre that we view as the main income source. That's not to say that there cannot be a revenue model that the council can actually apply. It's just that it makes the business case that's already a little bit strained in the small areas even more strained, because now we have to go into a small area. I mean, Jeffreys is a prime example. The closest national routes that go past Jeffreys is around 20, 30 Ks. You have to go and build a big stretch into that or rely on existing telecom infrastructure that's costly. You have a relatively small population. And as you mentioned, there's already some competition there. I mean, Eurotel already has some infrastructure in Jeffreys. So it makes the business case very dubious. So the moment that you levy fees, all you're going to find is that the fibre operators are just simply not going to go to that town. They're going to bypass it and go somewhere else. And then you never end up in a situation where your economy gets stimulated and you actually create an economy on top of this infrastructure. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you.